Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Professor Julian Zelizer. I teach courses at Princeton's Department of History and School of Public and International Affairs. And I'm thrilled to welcome back today to the school to talk about his brand new book, an alum. The book is called What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era. And the alum is Mr. Carlos Lozada, who earned his MPA from the school in 1997. He's the nonfiction book critic for the Washington Post, and he earned the Pulitzer Prize in Criticism in 2019. He has previously served as the Washington Post's Outlook editor and as managing editor for Foreign Policy magazine. Today's talk about his new book is going to last for an hour, and it will include questions and answers. So as we're speaking, you can submit questions through the talk using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will take the last question close to 5:30 when we wrap up the program. And also, if you would like captions for today's talk, please click on the closed captioning button in the menu at the bottom of the screen right now, and it should be working. So thank you so much for joining us today, Carlos. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you so much. I love being back in this community.
So let's get right into the book. And you read about 150 books, for everyone who hasn't heard about this yet, on the Trump presidency that have been written in the past few years. How did you pick the books? Was it random? Was there a structure to it? And what was the thinking behind the project?
Mm-hmm. Well, the project began almost accidentally initially. I started as a book critic at the Post in 2015, really just as Donald Trump was launching his presidential campaign. And so I decided to read several books, several of Trump's own books. Even though they're ghostwritten, they still reveal something about how he wishes to be perceived. And I wanted to see what I could learn about him. And then as he started winning primaries and gaining supporters, I started reading books about the white working class, which was a hot topic, early in this period. Then he won, and suddenly I'm reading books about the resistance. And I realized that has become my beat at the Washington Post. And so I kept on pursuing these sort of thematic looks at the big debates of the Trump era. And I would say shortly after the midterm election, I decided that I would try to take a more systematic look at all of these books to see kind of what they said about us as we grappled with Trump in real time. And so what I decided to do then was go back and sort of backfill, books that I've missed that I thought could give different perspectives on these different debates. And so I'd say that I read between maybe 80 and 90 books just in the course of my job as a critic for the Post, and then read maybe like another 50 or 60 to try to just kind of complete the picture to the extent that I could. It wasn't a real scientific method. I tried to cast a really broad net. I wanted to get books that were sort of very academic, but also very popular, books that were completely in the tank for Trump because they're revealing as well, and books that were very critical, and books that really touched less on Trump himself and more on the big debates and fights of this time, whether immigration, identity, race, or something else.
And I mean, do you have the sense that the volume or the quality of the books or the style of the books coming out about the Trump presidency in his first term are different than what we've seen from other presidents, at least presidents in your own time? Mm-hmm. Is there something different about what's happening?
Certainly the volume is different. There was an estimate I saw recently that in Obama's first term, there were some 500 books dealing with the Obama presidency in some way. And that sounds like a lot until you learn that there were about 1,200 books in the equivalent period for Donald Trump. And so certainly in that sense, I think that there's a significant difference. Also, just the the sort of revolving door nature of this administration has been such that you have, a lot of people coming out and writing quick memoirs of their time in the White House or in the administration, um, in ways that are unusual. I mean, there was not so long ago, there was a time when, um, when George Stephanopoulos wrote All Too Human, his memoir of working for Bill Clinton, it was considered, borderline scandalous that he would write it while Clinton was still in office. I mean, that is completely normal these days. And so I think in terms of the volume, in terms of the speed, there is a significant difference. That said, that doesn't necessarily undercut quality. It does in some cases, I would say, but I think you still have excellent books that are not always grappling with Trump himself, but that are trying to weigh in on the significant debates of this time.
And I mean, the title is provocative for some people, I'm sure, just an intellectual history of a period where many people don't think of that. They think of it as the opposite, the era of kind of screaming and disinformation. I mean, is that part of the objective, to give some coherence to the ideas of a period where we think ideas are almost kind of falling apart?
Yeah, I've gotten asked if I was trying to be satirical or something with the title of the book. I did want to try to grapple honestly with how people were assessing this time, and part of that sense of mayhem and prevalence of disinformation and the like is part of this time. I think we can't separate that from how we interpret and absorb and internalize the Trump era.
And do you think, I want to get into some of the books, but are there a few of the books that you read that it's always hard to tell, that at least you think might be the most enduring and outlast this period, as opposed to, books that are popular now but won't really be read 10, 20 years from now?
Yeah. That's hard to tell. I think that, the job of the critic is not necessarily to anticipate some future consensus, right? But to just sort of, deal honestly with the material in front of you in the moment that it's in front of you. That said, I do conclude the book with an epilogue that lists about a dozen books that, whether or not they will have huge staying power, they're the ones that have helped me understand this period best. And these are books that, to some extent, place the Trump era within the long arc of the American story. A book like One Person, No Vote by Carol Anderson, which looks at the history of voting suppression in America. A book like Unmaking the Presidency by Susan Hennessy and Benjamin Wittes, I found helpful in helping us see where these norms of presidential behavior that we lament being discarded today, kind of where they came from and what it means for them to be eroded. And so a book like Jennifer Silva's book, We're Still Here, which was one of these books about the white working class that didn't fall into the sort of simple binary of like, well, are these voters racist or are they just struggling economically? But that showed how these things can be inextricable, and how the challenge isn't whether these struggles lead them to support one president or another, but rather the challenge in her telling is how these struggles lead many voters to think that there's no room for them in the political system at all. And one moment I remember in We're Still Here is it was written and reported and researched during the 2016 campaign, and including election day. And so the author, Silva, goes off to vote, and she comes back with her little "I voted" sticker on her sweater. And the people she was interviewing, saw it, and they mocked her. They laughed at her for daring to believe that the political system would be responsive to her expression, right, to her desires, to her preferences. And that really struck me. So I think some of these books that managed to place this moment in a greater historical perspective, and also that broke through some of the kind of easy arguments of this period were the ones that I'm going to remember most.
And do the memoirs ever match up with those kinds of books? I mean, they appear on surface to be very different. But were you able ever to see in the memoirs what the structural people are talking about, or the big picture people are
You know,
talking?
sometimes there are moments in these books where you see at a micro level, you see some of these larger battles and larger forces. You know, one remnant of this period is going to be the impact on the Department of Justice, for instance, and the independence of the Department of Justice,
Mhm.
you know, within the American government. That's something that President Trump has done, you know, a good job of trying to beat down. And for instance, in a book like Peter Strzok's memoir, Peter Strzok was the FBI agent who was involved in both the Hillary Clinton emails investigation and the Donald Trump campaign Russia investigation. In his memoir Compromised, you know, you see those sharp divides between, you know, the FBI and justice, and his concern that the Justice Department leadership was becoming sort of like hyper politicized, right? So you see little snippets like that in the memoirs, but you know, everyone's the hero of their own story, you know, and you know, Jim Comey's memoir and Peter Strzok's memoir and others, you know, obviously have clear axes to grind and a clear, you know, often self-serving story to tell. But you know, I still found those enlightening and useful, because those are all. I mean, you know this far better as a historian. You know, the memoirs of a certain period help fill in, you know, pieces of the puzzle. You know, even if you know that often they're sort of painted in a self-serving way.
Do they have intellectual value?
Um, I think some of them would want to say that they do. You know, certainly Jim Comey, for instance, sort of sees himself as a higher level thinker in these issues. They're not the ones that I feel sort of the most drawn to in that particular sense. I still think that the more substantive work, often of historians or other analysts, ends up, you know, having more of that heft than do the books by sort of players in, you know, in the arena. That said, I mean, I think they're sort of inextricable. There are ways in which you know, the big picture insights have to be informed by those details and stories of how people operated in this time.
And how, we'll jump into a few more areas, but how, I mean, you are a book critic, you run a page or work on a page that criticizes books and evaluates books. How did that shape how you then went about writing your book?
Yeah, that was tricky. You know, I'd never been on this side of things before, and you know, I wonder sometimes if it's gonna make me far too sympathetic in the future to authors and kind of ruin me for my day job. But I think that was really healthy for me, and I think that in some ways the book is a reflection of what I've tried to do as a critic. One of the ways that I've approached the job, just in the 5 years that I've had it, is to try to not just be sort of hostage to whatever the publishing houses are spitting out every month, but to decide, well, what do I think is important right now, and then find a sort of book way into it. So if I think that our debates over truth are really significant right now, then I'll sort of wait for a critical mass of books on that subject to be available, and then dive into a bunch of them at once. And so I hope that this experience of writing the book will end up making me, you know, stronger as a critic. You know, one can hope that that's the way it works out. It's certainly nerve-wracking to be waiting for reviews. which I've never had to do before. I'm usually the one dishing them out. And so that's been unusual, that, to see that in the end, it's sort of another person, another mind at work, engaging with what you've done, and sort of seeing what works for them and what doesn't.
Have you been surprised? As an author, I'm often surprised at something critics or readers just start picking up on that I didn't necessarily think was the essential part of the book, or as important as others seem to think. I mean, have you had any of that, or is it pretty kind of predictable what people are picking up on?
No, I think, one of my favorite moments as a critic is when I occasionally hear from authors, and they say, you found something in my book that I didn't know was there, right? Or that I hadn't really put in that way. And so when I'm reading these reviews, I look for those things, right? I look for those kind of reactions that that are surprising, and sometimes people, read something into my discussion of a particular book that I didn't think was necessarily, extra insightful or inordinately harsh, and then but they read something there. Joe Klein reviewed the book in the New York Times, and he was like, well, this really reminds me of this distinction that Machiavelli makes in the discourses. And I was like, what? I have no idea what you're talking about. I maybe read that in school, years ago, and I was not thinking about it in this context. And so, I love seeing just the way other people engage with it and what it calls to mind for them, which is really what I do with all the books that I'm reading. I mean, this is in a way a book length review essay that covers 150 books, and sometimes all that matters to me about one book is like a single paragraph or a single sentence that really jumps out and that suddenly puts it in conversation with the others. And I feel sometimes that's unfair, but like there's some books that I spend pages and pages on, and some books that I touch on just glancingly because there was one thing that mattered to me in that book. And so it is a little unnerving, but also fun to see people do the same thing with me.
And then one group of books that you talk about are books by the critics of the administration, critics on the left, progressives. There's a volume of work on that. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can share with us some of what you found and your thoughts on that literature.
Yeah, so this was a literature that emerged very quickly in the Trump presidency. Some of the earliest books that came out, even during the transition period, sort of before after the election day, but even before inauguration day, there were books that I broadly characterize as the resistance books, and they were born in that feeling of that period. For people on the left, or just for people who really never thought that Donald Trump, could be elected or should be elected, these books were born in shock and anger and emotion, the kind of emotion that has become so prevalent that's described so well in all the polarization literature, for instance. And so it's many of the books are, I call them the, how awful I felt on election night books. These kind of intense, introspective, agonies. And I feel that a lot of these books end up speaking only to the converted, right? They call for conversations, but they really only, speak to one another, and are less than willing to engage with people who might see the world differently, and who they feel they might need to try to convert to their way of thinking, but don't really make the effort to. I found the resistance books to be a little disappointing in that sense. I mean, there's this constant refrain that Trump's moral compass is broken, and that doesn't necessarily mean that yours is always pointing north, right? I mean, there's very little dialogue happening in these books. There's a constant assumption of of, of sort of correctness, and that's part of the reason that I didn't particularly care for this little subgenre of the literature.
And then another genre of books, and let me pause to say, if anyone wants to send questions, you can already send them. I'll get to them a little later, but please send them in through the Q&A box. We'll get to those afterwards. Another genre of books revolve around the impeachment, which today seems as if it's not even an event, but for a while was the question, certainly in Washington. What did you find in those books?
Mm-hmm. So I read several impeachment books and reviewed them for the Post, and I thought about having an impeachment chapter, a chapter devoted solely to those books in my book. In the end, I decided against it, in part because of what you just suggested. It just sort of felt like it was this moment, and then it kind of just disappeared. And frankly, I didn't know if there would be that much interest in that sort of discussion. I did end up writing about the Mueller investigation, in part because that so captivated the public for almost 2 years, right? There was this constant sense of how Mueller will save you. Mueller, just protect Mueller, make sure you complete the investigation, and then wait till you see what Mueller finds. And in that stage of the game, his integrity, his sense of duty, all these things, his by the book approach, all these things were lionized by the public. Suddenly, the report is out. It doesn't accomplish what people had hoped it would accomplish. Well, certainly a lot of people hoped it would accomplish. And suddenly, you start seeing all these books where all those values that had been so praised in Robert Mueller were suddenly the problem. He's just too old school. He's too old fashioned. He got played. He was too by the book. And you could start anticipating that backlash, throughout this year, in lots of the different books that were coming out, from A Very Stable Genius to David Fromm's, Trumpocalypse book, to Masha Gessen's book, Jeffrey Toobin's book, and finally, Andrew Weissman's book, who was on the staff of the Mueller team, feeling that they hadn't really done everything that they should have done. And so I sort of see that as an interesting consequence of the Trump era as well, that the notion that all these virtues that 2 years prior were so lionized suddenly seem old hat. But of course, the greatest irony for me is that the Mueller report presents, which I treat as a book. I teach a college class for Notre Dame, and I make my students read the Mueller report, which I'm sure they don't like, but it's such a perfect kind of time capsule for this period, both because of the obsession surrounding it, but also because he leaves this sort of trail of breadcrumbs for Congress, and then virtually nothing from the Mueller report, which we obsessed over for 2 years, ends up in the actual articles of impeachment against the president. I think when people look back on this period and they notice that the one thing Donald Trump was impeached for was the Ukraine stuff, will seem remarkably weird when there is such a palette to choose from, in a sense, including Mueller's findings.
And then another group who's written about Trump and struggled in many ways, I'd say, is our conservatives. And that will be a big question. How do conservative thinkers and writers deal with Trump as president, as the head of the Republican Party? Mm-hmm. Tell us about that literature.
Yeah. So I found I divided the conservative books and conservative writers into sort of 3 buckets. They're the people who right away kind of made their peace and made their bet with the new order, and just wrote incredibly sycophantic books about Donald Trump. One of them, of course, you know well, having written about him so extensively. Newt Gingrich has written 4 books on Trump in 4 years, and these books simply mimic his tics and his tendencies, and explain away any of his sort of less savory traits, or simply imagined him to be someone else than what he is. Then you have the never Trump conservatives, right, who came out against him very early on and have stuck to their guns, for better or worse. And those are probably the best books among the conservative camp in my estimation from this period, and that they really try to grapple with what has happened to the party and to the conservative movement. What I feel they do less well is really to maybe wrestle with their own roles in sort of enabling all of this. These were in many cases people who would have easily either continued ignoring the sort of effervescence of this base and the extreme forces that were forming within the party, or actively stoking them, as long as they could continue creating and leading to kind of like moderate, Jeb Bush, John McCain type nominees. That didn't happen this time, and suddenly it's like, oh, this is a disaster. What do we do? So I feel that there was not enough of a recognition of that sort of mea culpa aspect to it. And then finally, there are the sort of semi-intellectual conservatives who try to retrofit a sort of ideology, or ideological coherence, at least, onto Trump and Trumpism. And that just feels almost like a fool's errand when you read these books. More often they sort of claim to be with Trump for his beliefs and his ideas, but really they love him for his enemies. They feel that they share common enemies, and that's enough. And some of the new forms and new debates that you're seeing over kind of like national conservatism and the like, I think are part of that. Are efforts to pretend there's something coherent called Trumpism, rather than just sort of the whims and impulses of this one man.
And is there, outside of that narrow band of literature, I'm thinking of other periods of Republican power, you'll have a proliferation of writing about conservatism, not to justify the president or explain the president, but a growth of thinking of conservatism as a philosophy. So you had that with Reagan for sure, and even with George W. Bush with neoconservatives. Is there anything like that now, or is it all about President Trump and explaining what you're talking about?
I think that they certainly purport to be creating something larger, to creating a sort of model of conservatism that outlasts Trump. I think it's so wrapped up in the kind of leadership that Trump provides, the sort of very strongman conservatism, that like it's hard to know what the values are except for the imposition of some value. And so I don't quite see where the movement goes, because even if there's a new administration, even if Trump loses next month, he will still be a dominant force in Republican politics. And I don't know that there's enough in the, what would you call it? The Ben Sass, Mitt Romney, corners of the conservative movement to create a really lasting alternative.
And then, I assume part of it is that a lot of the conservative intellectuals are distancing themselves from this moment, so probably less likely to dive into philosophical tracks at this right now.
Yeah, you can already see there's starting to be some, just a little bit of distance as you see where people are going to be positioning themselves after an election, should Trump lose. And, there will be those who basically claim, I was really just there to kind of like try to keep things on an even keel, but he was never a real conservative, wink, wink, and almost like pretending that this didn't happen, which will be very hard to do.
And then there's been a lot of writing, obviously, on issues like race, really an incredible period of writing in some ways. What did you kind of see in that whole genre, identity, race, social issues?
Yeah, you're right. That was there's been a boom in writing on identity. And there's an expression going around when it's usually directed at conservative politicians who are moving from sort of dog whistle politics to just overt, outright prejudice in their rhetoric. And what people say is like, oh, they're saying the quiet part out loud, right? That's one of these terms. But in many ways, everyone is saying the quiet part out loud right now. Black Lives Matter is saying the quiet part out loud. The Me Too movement is saying the quiet part out loud. And those aren't necessarily bad things. In the writing on identity, one of the things that struck me the most is that, in these debates, we're seeing so much about group rights and group representation. And as if that's all that's sort of going on here. But in these books, what you often see, especially in the memoirs, what you often see is just a quest, a constant quest, and like this piercing cry for just individual dignity, right? Of the person. And maybe that quest is easier with the strength of a group behind you. But in these books, including by one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, a book by Patrisse Khan-Cullors called "When They Call You a Terrorist," or a book that got so much attention, "How to Be an Anti-Racist" by Ibram Kendi. What you find in these books is less this sort of strident call for group representation at all times, but really just a demand to be respected as an individual, and how that is behind movements that in turn become about collective representation.
And we're getting a bunch of questions, so we'll get to those soon. But I had two more questions I was hoping to ask. One, I mean, you categorize the different ideas and literatures, but do you think there's been an evolution in the writing about the presidency, about this president in the last 4 years, or is it kind of static? Is it revolving around these buckets of issues that you're talking about?
I think there's been an evolution in the sense that, and I mean, these are hard and not easy lines to draw in all cases because there's so much variety among these books. But I think that we are able a little bit to move beyond a sort of like maniacal obsession with just the man at the center of the story, right? The early books, a lot of the most high profile books, are just completely centered on Donald Trump, as if he is the point, right? As if he is the thing that matters right now. A book like Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff, right, was a perfect example. It came out early in the administration and was just all about the mayhem in the Trump White House. And that's all anyone wanted to talk about. But I find that the most interesting books are really, the most interesting books of the Trump era are not about Trump at all. They're about the country. They're about, as I said, the ways in which this period fits into the longer arc of American history. And I hope that those are the kinds of volumes that will begin to not just merit, but receive more attention. And certainly, I think we are seeing more of them, even as a book like Rage by Bob Woodward comes out and sucks up all the oxygen for a few weeks.
And let me ask one last question, and we're going to get to the Q&A. But I mean, when I studied intellectual history in college, and I still study it every now and then, every period has a set of ideas. So beyond the books, beyond the types of books, there are ideas that animate a period. So you do the progressive era, you'll talk about pragmatism. And as an example, is there anything like that that you could see yet from all this reading, a certain
Mhm.
set of core questions and even principles that are defining us as a nation through what you read about?
Mhm. Um, I think of a couple of things. Um, One, and of course, this is not solely limited to these 4 years worth of books or of intellectual life that I tried to get at in this book. Um, but one is just an evaluation of the extent and the impact of political polarization
Mhm.
in American life. I think that will be sort of overwhelmingly one of the things that we think about when we look back on this time. Um, and I'm actually in the midst of reading several books together on polarization to try to write a piece for the Post in the next couple of weeks. But I think that's a major part of the story. And related to that, I think if we look at, like, one thing I've tried to do is find a couple of different authors here and there that um, whose body of work tells us something about today. And so, for instance, a couple of years ago, I did a long essay about all the works of Samuel Huntington, and how I think, in many ways, over the course of his career, he is sort of a prophet of this time. Um, and someone that I'd like to do that with, but I haven't yet. Maybe that'll be the next thing I write. Um, is Robert Putnam, and I think that there are ways in which his study of civil society, from looking at politics in Italy to exploring um, to exploring the role of religion and the role of civic association and associational life in America. I think that story, whichever way it goes, whether it's the bowling alone story, that you can relate also to the Deaths of Despair story that Case and Deaton have written about, um, or whether it goes more into what I think I haven't read yet is his latest book, The Upswing, that attempts to take. I think is moving us he has a slightly more optimistic view of where that ends up. I think which Putnam prevails will tell us a lot about how we think about this period.
So let's take a few questions from the audience because there's a lot already here, and feel free to keep sending. We'll get to as many as we can. The first is from our colleague here, Deborah Amos, who's also a reporter at NPR. Please ask about the Me Too books. I was struck when you wrote, I learned things I hadn't even thought about, in particular about the way men see rape, the way women do. Is there a theme that runs through Jean Carroll and Jodi Kantor's book and others?
That was certainly one of the most just eye-opening experiences for me, not just being alive and witnessing the Me Too movement at work, but then absorbing a lot of these books. There were just things I hadn't thought of. I had the luxury of not having thought of. How from a young age, girls are taught to suppress their anger and boys to express it, right? How one incredible moment in Soraya Kamali's book, Rage Becomes Her, says, when you ask men what their greatest fear of prison is, it's rape. What does it say that prison is to men what just ordinary life is to women? Things that I hadn't in some ways needed or felt like I needed to wrestle with. And when I was reading these books, I would just like turn to my wife in the evening and be like, I didn't know this, I didn't know that. She just looks at me like, what planet have you been living on? You know, like this is what it means to be alive. And so I felt that a lot of the memoirs of the Me Too age were incredibly powerful and resonant. Chanel Miller's Know My Name, probably foremost among them. But you know, the Slate writer Lily Loughborough, you know, says that testimony like that matters, but testimony is not enough to dislodge power. But it's certainly a beginning. And when it comes to political life, you know, the notion that male anger is you know, lionized and held up as you know, righteous and important and powerful, and female anger is generally, you know, pathologized, is considered you know, something to kind of hide away, unless it's in the service of very specific pre-approved causes, you know, whether it's children or other sort of safe issues for women to engage in. And so for me, those books were probably the issues in which I felt I needed the most catching up to do as just a reader and citizen. And you know, it's one of the it's sort of an irony of this time that, you know, the Me Too movement has happened at a time when the occupant of the Oval Office sort of like famously, willingly, you know, denigrates women, has multiple credible accusations of sexual assault against him. And, you know, I wonder if that's a contradiction, you know, if say Trump had not sought higher office, would not a, you know, reality show host, real estate developer with a questionable personal life have become one of the Me Too movement's top targets? But sometimes a writer like Rebecca Traister writes in her book, I can't remember the title right now, I'm blanking on her book, that, you know, maybe it took that level of anger of seeing Trump elected to help propel this movement forward as well.
The next question is from Gary Hull. Have you found a good book or two that go deep into the whys of Trump, why Trump was elected, and don't just detail out the low-hanging fruit theories?
There's a book called Identity Crisis by 3 political scientists. Lynn Vavrek, I have all these books in my head, and I can't repeat all the titles and authors. But Identity Crisis is a very good book that explores the question of racial attitudes and economic trouble. And its general point is that it's not that people were compelled to vote for Trump purely because they worried about losing their jobs, but because they worried about losing their jobs to those people who I don't like, who don't look like me, right? This notion of kind of racialized economics is what they called it. So that does a really good job, I think, of delving into those arguments. There's also, you know, if you're interested in, you know, the connections surrounding Russian interference in the election, right? And to get to a very specific aspect of why Trump was or was not elected, Kathleen Hall Jamieson of the University of Pennsylvania, I think, did the best job, at least that I've read, in exploring to what extent Russian interference really had a role. In her view, it did significantly. Less so through specific manipulations and more by, say, the releases of, you know, emails and information through WikiLeaks, you know, having a direct impact, for instance, on the kind of questions that were asked during the presidential debates. And so, you know, she can't sort of say like, here's how many votes were shifted or here's what happened as a result of this, but she makes a persuasive broad case for that. So I would point to those, you know, pair of books as ones that I can think of right now that that had that get to that question. The larger case, of course, that that the degree of sort of polarization led to a candidate like Trump being palatable and being, appetizing for a large portion of the electorate, is evident in books like Uncivil Agreement by Liliana Mason, and in fact, several books kind of like piggyback off hers, like Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized, and David French's book, and on polarization, all kind of build off Mason's book. So it's a little dense. Ordinary least squares and regression analysis come up a lot in this book. It's not a popular audience book, but the kind of things you learn at the School of Public International Affairs. But I think that it's a very useful book to try to understand why the electorate became so polarized and why Trump was even possible.
And I don't know who asked it, but a very specific question. Did you find John Bolton's book credible and informative?
I found it credible. I'm going to be very specific about those two adjectives. I found it credible. There was nothing in it that made me think that he was really kind of pulling a fast one in some way. I found it informative, I suppose, in the sense that there were particular stories and episodes that were interesting to me. I found it very weird. I found that book I found that Bolton almost acted as if he, as National Security Advisor, was just an observer in this White House and was sort of just looking at all these people doing all these crazy things around him and kind of taking detailed notes for a book, right? Almost like he was a reporter embedded in the White House rather than an active player and participant in it. I found it, and so that's why I found the experience of reading it kind of annoying, because he points out some problem or something he doesn't like and then doesn't do much about it because maybe he felt he couldn't, or I never really asked Trump why he was so favorably disposed to Putin. Well, like, why not? You're the National Security Advisor, like that might be relevant information. And so the book was sort of frustrating in that way, but I didn't feel that it was deceptive.
And I'm going to jump ahead to a question related to this by Judy Marino, who asks, I'll just read part of it. Do you feel these writers, I assume she means memoir writers, but maybe others, had an agenda in writing these books? Is it about exposure to them, for themselves, to make money, to try to encourage Republicans to speak out, to save their own souls as a mea culpa? What was your take on all that?
I think all of the above. I think that certainly, and everyone is the hero of their own story, right? And so these memoir writers often place themselves in these kind of like essential roles, like, between me and Trump, I'm between, chaos and Trump, like I stood, courageously to keep things going. I think that, some of them have a clear and obvious axe to grind, and that's not even, that's not necessarily bad, right? As long as you know what you're getting, right? Even a book, this is slightly different, but a book like Mary Trump's memoir, but Trump's niece writes this book, she felt her side of the family was treated horribly by Donald Trump, by her grandfather, Fred Trump, and probably if they hadn't been cut out of their part of the inheritance, there would never have been this memoir, right? Talking about how awful Trump was. But she makes that clear, there's no pretense there. There are some of these memoirs that are deeply disappointing, the ones that come out of the administration, probably foremost for me being the anonymous memoir, a warning by the unknown senior Trump administration official who claims to have been part of this internal resistance to Trump, inside, and you don't really learn anything from it. It's 259 pages, and you learn kind of zip because usually anonymity is granted in order to acquire more information, but here it justifies giving less because the author is so intent on protecting that secret identity that you don't really get anything. You don't really get any identifiable information about what actually happened and what this person was able to stop, if anything. And so they're all over the map. Some of them are really disappointing. Some, have a clear axe to grind. Some feel far too self-serving, like James Comey's memoir, to my mind. But some are just informative and entertaining. Like Cliff Sims wrote a book called Team of Vipers and he was sort of a mid-level communications guy inside the Trump White House right at the beginning. And yet you just get a really good sense of day-to-day life inside the Trump White House. And that was useful in its own way. But I do think that there were people who kind of saw an opportunity to sell a book, to get on TV, make some money. And that doesn't mean their books were bad. It just means that when you look at motivations, they're all over the place and they're very human in that way.
Was there any divergence in the memoirs? I mean, I don't even remember. Has anyone written it's pretty functional and much more structured than you think?
Sean Spicer wrote an utterly forgettable memoir called The Briefing. And, part of the issue there is that so many of the books of this time either have to be, stridently anti-Trump or completely in the tank in order to get any attention. And he was like mainly in the tank. He was like, waiting in the tank. And so his book kind of went nowhere. But he did sort of paint the glossiest picture possible on some of these moments. For instance, the moment where he lost his own credibility, from the very beginning, when he came out that first weekend and said that Trump's inauguration crowd was bigger than Obama's and the biggest ever, period, right? He makes clear that he was pulling those numbers and those facts out of nowhere. And yet at the same time, he still tries to defend the president and says that he just misunderstood, Trump's instructions. And Trump had really just wanted him to get out the best facts possible and to just make sure that, people weren't seeing a distorted picture. And so he keeps kind of debasing himself in front of the president. They kind of like threw him out in a very kind of embarrassing fashion. And so, but yet he was trying to suggest that things weren't really as chaotic as they kind of were in a blindingly obvious way.
We only have a few minutes left, but let me try to get a few more in. Someone asked, has anything you read given you insight on QAnon and its expanding influence in the GOP? That's from Donna Oglesby.
I was limited in a sense by the pace of book publishing, and so there were not a lot of sort of QAnon focused books that came out in time for me to write about them. That said, there were plenty of books about conspiracy and about the role that has played in the Trump era. A book that I very much enjoyed was one of these books that I kind of came back to later. I didn't read in the time when it came out. And it's called A Lot of People Are Saying, by two political scientists whose names I'm forgetting at this moment. But it showed how in the Trump era, sort of QAnon is a little bit of an oddity, or maybe Trump's the oddity, because conspiracies traditionally are extremely elaborate, right? These tying together of all these weird disparate dots, and you go into like 9/11 truther conspiracies, and there is like such specificity about the heat at which certain metals melt, and everything is tied together in this way. Conspiracies in the Trump era are just like hoax, rigged, fake. They're like single word moments. That it's the sheer power of repetition that is the power of the conspiracy in the Trump era. But QAnon is sort of hearkening back to more, these like weird, elaborate, conspiracies of old. And you see some elements of this in the sort of like alt-right online communities that have had very good books written about. Angela Nagel wrote a book called something about the normies. I'm blanking on the name again. Sorry. In which she shows that often these things start with this kind of like ironic, playful arguments that quickly drop the irony and just become like the actual belief system. And I think that there may have been some elements of that in the origins of these conspiracies. And of course, QAnon takes them to like a much deeper level. And Trump, as usual, is sort of entirely unwilling to disavow any community that might conceivably give him votes and support him. And so QAnon is part of that.
I think we're gonna have to do a little conclusion. You had a lot of questions, so everyone else, I'm sorry I didn't get to your questions, and I'm sorry. In the virtual world, there's no post-talk schmooze, but I do hope that down the line, Carlos, you can return in person to our campus. And again, the book is What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era. And my copy is on the computer, so I can't raise it up and show it. And it's out with Simon & Schuster.
I've got one.
Perfect. Available everywhere. Carlos Lozada, the author. And I think I asked earlier if there's an intellectual history of this period. And I think through the discussion, you kind of point to a pretty vibrant era of publishing, actually, not just about the president and the inside story, but about what it all means and where it came from. I think you make a really convincing case. So everyone, get this book, read it. I think you will really enjoy it. And thanks so much for spending the afternoon with us today.
Thank you.
Okay, bye everyone. Have a good afternoon and stay safe. Bye-bye.